Is there evidence in the literature that women and young girls should exercise differently in relation to the different phases of their menstrual cycle? Does the phase of a menstrual cycle affect muscle and strength gains? Should females be eating differently during the different phases of their menstrual cycle? If I'm on birth control and not having a menstrual cycle, does that change how I should be exercising and eating? I've heard so many different recommendations. How do I know who to believe and who to trust? These are just some of the questions and frustrations I hear from women and young girls that are so confused about what to do with nutrition and exercise during their menstrual cycle. Welcome to the Foundational Health Podcast, where we provide education and inspiration to help guide you on your journey to look better, feel better, and most importantly, heal better. Hello and welcome to the Foundational Health Podcast. I'm Dr. Kevin Schultz, and today we're going to talk about menstrual cycles and whether or not where a female is at in their menstrual cycle should play a role in what they eat and when they eat it, as well as how they exercise, or even if they should be exercising at all, depending on what phase they're in. The intent of the podcast today is to talk about real science as it applies to nutrition and exercise during a menstrual cycle, and then to simplify the message from there, to remove the confusion from this discussion, hopefully once and for all, or at least until we have better science. So what is referred to as cycle training or cycle syncing, and there's other terminology out there as well. It's a very hot topic right now in especially the social media world for young girls, for athletes in general, but really for all women that are in those menstrual cycle years of life. So even if you've never heard of that, I promise today's podcast will be very beneficial if you are a female in the menstruating years of life. I promise to give you some very actionable takeaways, simple things you can do with your lifestyle to help balance hormones and improve really every aspect of your health, not just balancing hormones, and certainly not just trying to help with symptoms during your menstrual cycle, even though that is often where the questions that I get and where the conversation leads to is because of symptoms that are coming up from this imbalance in hormones, or not even necessarily an imbalance of hormones, but just the symptoms that a woman or a girl is struggling with and wants to know, is there something that I can do differently to help with this? So my hope and prayer for this podcast today is that anyone who listens really sees the importance of sharing this not only with the women in their life that are still having menstrual cycles, but also very important, the young girls, so they can better understand what they're going through and then to start off on the right foot with how to approach exercise and nutrition during that monthly cycle. All right, so we're going to jump right into the basic science of what is a menstrual cycle. So here's what we know when it comes to hormones during a menstrual cycle. For the most part, it's pretty simple. Hormones start low at the beginning of the cycle, and that is during the menstruation or the bleeding phase. And then estrogen starts to increase from there until it peaks just before what's called the ovulation phase. And then during the ovulation phase, there's an increase in what's known as the luteinizing hormone. During the next phase of the cycle, that kind of second half of the cycle, this is where there is another rise in estrogen, estradiol specifically, and then there's also a dramatic increase in progesterone during this phase. So when you hear about all the different phases of the cycle, it is referring to the different shifts in hormones throughout the cycle. And kind of surprising, I learned about all of that stuff in school, obviously. This is not my area of expertise, being a chiropractor, but helping women through health challenges over the years, obviously I know about these things. But I learned a lot of things as I was preparing for this podcast. And one of the shocking things is, as I was talking to women and young girls and doing my research, the majority of women don't know about those hormonal changes and don't know the specifics of their cycle. which obviously you don't have to know the deep science behind that, but I think it is incredibly important to at least have a basic understanding and to understand what is happening. And this is where symptoms come in. This is why there are different parts of the cycle. And then obviously, as it pertains to the podcast today, how your exercise should change, how your nutrition should change, or other lifestyle factors, or if they should change at all. So the medical literature around the menstrual cycle says it's 28 days long. And the reason it says it's 28 days long is because this is considered the average length when you look at large groups of women and their menstrual cycle. However, actual cycle length can vary pretty dramatically. So this was actually kind of shocking to me because I was trained and all I've ever read in the past was 28 days, or right around that 28 days. But in reality, when you look at averages, it can be as little as 21 days or as many as 35 days. And that's a pretty big variance. So from one woman to the next, it can be a 14-day difference in the length of their cycle. But that 21 to 35 day range, right in the middle, of course, is 28. And that simplifies the message in medical literature, which is why it's always talked about as being a 28-day cycle. So as I just mentioned, menstrual cycle training or cycle syncing is a very hot topic right now in especially the exercise world. So we're going to take a little closer look on what that looks like and then really what it's based on. So keep in mind as I go through this, recommendations from program to program or the woman or the doctor or the person that you're following, that can vary from program to program. It can vary, I shouldn't say tremendously, but it can vary quite a bit. But the majority of the programs that I looked at, the majority of the books, the podcasts, the things that I read, the research, it's going to recommend something similar to what I am going to describe for you here. So you have 4 phases of the menstrual cycle throughout that 21 to 35 day range. The first phase is called the menstrual phase, and this is where hormones are very low. So hormones are really low, and then as a result of that, because of this also being that bleeding phase, the general recommendation is low intensity type workouts or just flat out rest depending on symptoms and how a woman is feeling. But that's the typical recommendation there. And then you have the second phase, you move into the follicular phase. This is where estrogen and FSH, which is also, it's called FSH, but it's follicle stimulating, rather, hormone, that will start to rise. And then because of especially estrogen rising, this is where the recommendation is to prioritize things like strength training, to prioritize running, and then also things like high intensity interval training. Those would all increase in recommendations during the follicular phase. The third phase is called the ovulatory phase. Really, ovulation is just one day, but there's this ovulatory phase. The recommendation there is continue to strength train, but you're not doing it. You're not going all out. You're not doing it as heavy. You're not doing as big of a load. You just want to focus on good form to prevent injury. You could also still do some high intensity interval training during this phase. And then this is where you would want to incorporate more things like endurance type exercise. And then last but not least, the fourth phase is the luteal phase. And during this phase, this is where there is an increase in progesterone. So that second phase was that increase in estrogen. Now we have the fourth phase, the increase in progesterone. And with the increase in progesterone, this is where the recommendations come in for things like gentle movements, yoga, low intensity rest, which of course, all of those things are always good things all of the time. The recommendation is just to focus more on those and less on things like strength, resistance training, HIIT training during that phase. So there is a theory that these different phases of the cycle will affect a woman's ability to do strength training in the sense that the rise and fall of the hormones can affect the ability to make muscles grow and the ability to make muscles stronger as well as the ability to recover from workouts, hence the recommendations. So, specifically, the theory when it comes to making muscles bigger and stronger. Let me stop there for a second. So, when I say muscles bigger and stronger, I realize that the majority of women that are listening are probably thinking, like, "Oh, well, I don't care about getting bigger and stronger." So, I'm not talking about bodybuilding type stuff here. We're just talking about bigger muscles in the sense that you're growing them, even if it's small, lean muscle mass, and stronger, because that's always the goal. We're not talking about powerlifting, just becoming stronger as we age, or at the bare minimum, maintaining muscle size and strength as you age, no matter what phase of life that you're in. So we're not talking about getting big and bulky here. We're just talking about growing muscles, making them stronger for overall good health. But of course, somebody that is focused on becoming a bodybuilder, athlete, whatever it is, then all of this would apply as well. So specifically, if you go back to that theory, when it comes to making muscles bigger and stronger, the theory is based on that progesterone is what's called catabolic, and then estrogen is referred to as anabolic. So catabolic means to break down, or specifically to break down a molecule. And then anabolic means to build. So when referring to this topic, we're referring to catabolic, meaning to break down a muscle, or anabolic, to build up a muscle. So there's countless books. There are programs, there's social media posts constantly, whether it is TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, countless things out there, especially for women, that are really specifically designed around this theory of the catabolic, anabolic messaging when it comes to muscle building or muscle breakdown. So the messaging is that because progesterone is catabolic, again, breaks down muscle, then you don't want to strength train during the luteal phase because it has a negative effect, or it really won't have an effect. So that's the theory. And then instead, you want to focus on strength training during that follicular phase when estrogen is high, because estrogen is anabolic, which helps you build muscle better. So here is where all of this gets very interesting, and like crazy interesting to me, because to be honest, it's been requested to do this podcast by a few of my patients, some relatives over the last month or so. And by no means was this an area of expertise for me, being a man. Not that that's an excuse, but not an area of expertise. So this is where this was surprising and very, very interesting to me, because when I looked at it from the outside looking in, I'm like, well, that makes sense. You've got these hormone fluctuations in different phases of the cycle. So yeah, of course, you would want to exercise differently. You would want to potentially eat differently. And I am not saying that you shouldn't, so stay tuned for that. But here is where it gets very interesting. The main recommendations for menstrual phase, cycle, syncing, training comes from mouse and rat studies. They took mice and rats and did things like removing ovaries entirely to shut down, for instance, the production of certain hormones like progesterone, to see what it did to the mice and rats. And because it impaired the animal's ability to grow or even maintain muscle, they then, based off that study, they developed the theory that women shouldn't train during the phase of their cycle when progesterone is high, because if you recall, progesterone is considered catabolic, meaning to break down muscle. So the theory came from these rat and mice studies that says, okay, don't train during that phase of the cycle, or don't strength train during that phase of the cycle. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting, and this should be, in my opinion, whether you do currently exercise or whether you're planning to exercise, which hopefully you are, this should be your number one takeaway as a female from this podcast. So there's research from a woman named Colenso-Semple, Great researcher. We'll have something in our show notes, a link to her where you can check out some of her research. But she's finally looking at actual studies on women, not mice and rats, actual studies on women in different phases of their cycle, and then doing the best science we know, meaning there's different ways to look at this, but she's doing the best that we know of to look at how does that affect muscle strength? How does that affect muscle growth? How does that affect maintaining muscle? And she has found over and over in her research that the phase of your cycle simply does not matter when it comes to making muscles bigger, stronger, maintaining muscle growth. So I'll repeat that. The human research shows that it simply doesn't matter. So even though that might be upsetting to somebody that's listening right now, this is good news. And I'll kind of break down why this is good news, because it really just simplifies everything. So the question might be at this point, and you might be thinking, but how can that be if we know progesterone is catabolic, breaks down muscle? This is where science often gets things wrong, and it's not as simple as just saying progesterone is catabolic, progesterone breaks down muscle, therefore don't work out. So this is where sometimes science is not right, and it's not right because it's not done right in the first place, meaning the study isn't done right. So when they look at progesterone on its own in isolation, they find that it has catabolic properties. But guess what? The body doesn't work in isolation. The body doesn't work that way. So there are 37 billion, I didn't even know that was a thing. I had to Google this. There are 37 billion, that's a 37 followed by 21 zeros, chemical reactions that take place in the human body every second of every day. This is why when you look at studies where they will take a molecule or a chemical or a substance out of the body and they look at it in isolation, it doesn't always and very often will not apply to what actually happens in the human body. 37 followed by 21 zero chemical reactions every second of every single day. So that is why you cannot look at things in isolation. Actually, this is maybe not the best example, but something that just popped into my head is like if you look at tomatoes, if you look at lemons, they're acidic. And so a lot of times some people are still recommending this, but in the past it would say if you have inflammation, if your body's already too acidic, avoid lemons because they're acidic, avoid tomatoes because they're acidic. But guess what happens when you take that acidic lemon and acidic tomato and put it in the body? It does the opposite. It has the opposite effect. And it's because you can't study it in isolation. Once it goes into the body, it goes through chemical reactions and it has a completely polar opposite effect on the human body. Again, I don't know if that fully applies here, but hopefully gets my point across. Nutridyne is my number one choice for the vast majority of my family supplements. I'm a huge fan of nearly everyone taking what I call the foundational 4 supplements: a multivitamin, a spore-based probiotic, omega-3 fish oil, and vitamin D3 with K2. The large majority of people are deficient in many of these nutrients, and they are the building blocks to gut health, immune system strength, brain health, heart health, and every other aspect of your health. Don't fall into the trap of chasing symptoms with supplements, and instead start to rebuild your health with the foundational 4. We partnered with Nutridyne so that you can save 15% on every order, and not just with the foundational 4, but all of your other supplements as well. Go to foundationalhealth365.com, click on Shop Brands, and then Nutridyne, set up your account, and you're all set to automatically get 15% off all orders. Now let's get back to the Foundational Health Podcast. Before I move on, I want to point out the really, really obvious here. I'm not a woman. So I am not saying you can't or shouldn't train differently during your cycle. I am just saying don't do it because you read something or listened to someone who said you should do this based on a mouse study or a synthetic hormone in isolation study. what you want to focus on is listening to your body as you track your cycle. So, in one of my past podcasts that I highly recommend going back and listening to is Balancing Female Hormones. And I reference a woman named Stacy Sims, who's also doing some fantastic research when it comes to women and their cycles, women for whether they're going through their cycle phase of life or whether they're post-menopause or going through menopause. She's doing incredible research. And basically, her recommendation is what I just said, that you want to focus on listening to your body as you track your cycle. And tracking your cycle is incredibly important because you can't just look at this 28-day recommendation from medical literature and say, oh, for days 1 through 7, I should do this, and days 8 through 14, I should do this. It is not that simple because the cycle is different from woman to woman. And remember, that variance is 21 to 35 days. So you can be very off if you're following just some general recommendations. Instead, you want to track your cycle so you know where you're at. And you can't just, also important to point out, focus on like downloading an app for tracking your cycle, because that's not going to be accurate, because it's, again, based on these general recommendations. You want to focus on your cycle, listening to your body as you track your cycle, but also don't fall into the mindset that just because you feel a certain way during a certain time of your cycle, that this is how you're supposed to feel and you're always going to feel this way. This is where lifestyle comes in. If you have horrific cramps during your menstruation portion of your cycle, don't say, well, this is just how my body responds. My sister has cramps. My mom has cramps. She said that she's always had cramps. Everybody in our family does. This is just what happens in my family. Instead, ask, what could I or what can I do differently with my exercise, with my spinal health, my sleep, my hydration, nutrition, whatever it is? What can I do differently lifestyle-wise to potentially change how I feel during that phase of my cycle? So by no means am I claiming to understand what it feels like to go through a menstrual cycle. And I say this because I've done in-person workshops on this in the past and been called out by women. How can you understand? And I don't. I am not claiming that I know what it feels like. I'm not in any way trying to just simplify it and say, oh, just do this and everything will get better. Hopefully that's not how this is coming across at all. So I realize there are countless factors, and things vary tremendously from girl to girl. They vary tremendously from woman to woman. So I realize this isn't simple. I also realize that often with some pretty simple changes, you can make some pretty drastic differences. I've seen this in a large number of my patients, a large number of my family members over the years, and in fact with my wife. When I met her, she's 27, 28 years old, something like that. Horrific cramps, horrific problems with her menstrual cycle until she adapted some lifestyle changes, and those things gradually improved to the point where it isn't much of a factor at all anymore for her. Certainly, there's still some changes. Those are normal, but it isn't to the point where horrible cramps, can't function, mood swings, all of that anymore. Before I forget, I want to quickly discuss birth control. It's one of the questions that I mentioned in the introduction. So there is no legitimate science that shows you should change anything for exercise or nutrition when on birth control. And so this, again, is good news in that sense, because it simplifies. You don't have to worry about like, oh, because it's changing my hormones, because it's shutting it down, is this affecting my ability to gain muscle? There's no science on humans that show that. So it's not my place to tell you whether to be on birth control, obviously, or whether not to be on. And just like anything, you have to weigh the pros and the cons, but I personally am not a fan at all. I can't mention birth control without saying this. There are certainly many short and long-term concerns with birth control. You can Google these. They aren't like a little-known fact. These are very obvious, well-known facts in the literature and in the studies. Some of those are increased risk of blood clots, increased risk of strokes, increased risk of heart attacks, increased risks of certain types of cancer. Of course, the longer that you're on these things, the bigger those risks become. The higher the dose, the bigger the risks become. So it really just comes down to this. You can't shut down normal hormone production in the body and think it's only going to have an effect on reproduction, or it's only going to have an effect on acne or mood swings or whatever symptom that you're treating with the birth control. It's not that simple, because female hormones play a role in every single bodily function, and they also play a significant role in every single bodily organ and structure without exception, from bones to muscles to ligaments to tendons to your brain, your heart. Every single one without exception, hormones play a huge role in that. So you can't shut down or reduce these hormones without side effects, both short and long term, which is why I'm not and never will recommend them or be a fan of them. That being said, everyone's situation is different. This is where you have to weigh the pros and the cons, do your own research instead of just trusting a doctor that may tell you, I'm not saying they will always, but they may tell you, oh, there's no concerns, don't worry about that. Here is your prescription. So do your own research, make the best decision for you. But as it pertains to the topic of this podcast, from what we currently know from legitimate studies, you can still gain muscle strength and size even when you are taking birth control. And then to reiterate, you can gain muscle strength, size, maintain muscle, no matter what phase of your cycle is in, no matter what your hormones are doing, whether they're up, whether they're down, whether it's progesterone rising, falling, estrogen, estradiol rising, falling, you can still make the same muscle gains and strength gains. We're going to move more into the fun stuff, the stuff that I always find to be the most fun, which is actionable lifestyle takeaways, simple steps, things that you can take right now, incorporate into your life. This is going to be kind of a quick fire, rapid fire. I'll explain some things a little bit more, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this. This is by no means something where I'm saying like every woman should do this specific recommendation for exercise or nutrition. It's more of general recommendations just for educational purposes, because if you're following these what we call foundational health habits, it is going to make a massive difference in overall health, overall hormone balance. Starting with exercise, I want to reiterate that I am not saying you shouldn't do cycle training. If that is what works for you and you feel you're doing a good job of tracking your cycle instead of just assuming it's 28 days, then by all means, you can do cycle training. Just keep in mind, if your goal is to build muscle, to get stronger, to maintain muscle, when you're doing training according to your menstrual cycle and according to most of these programs, you're reducing your strength training every month. I shouldn't just say strength training, your resistance training using weights, bands, machines to gain strength as well as muscle size. When you're reducing your resistance training every month according to cycle training, you're reducing it by about 50% every single month. So that's a pretty big deal, especially if you're an athlete or specifically training for something or have goals short and long term for your muscles. As it pertains to cardio, as I talked about in my Balancing Female Hormones podcast, unfortunately, long endurance zone 2 cardio, the favorite of especially of most middle-aged women, I find, unfortunately, that long endurance zone 2 cardio, it's just not great at all for female hormones. So instead, you want to focus on HIIT training, high intensity interval training, or it's called sprint training. There's lots of different names for it. That's what you want to focus on for your cardio, which in turn, this high intensity interval training will increase muscle growth and strength because of how it affects growth hormones and how it helps balance hormones better. So there are countless studies on the benefits of this. And for the most part, almost anything works as long as you're pushing yourself. So high intensity interval training doesn't mean like you just go at a light to moderate pace and then rest, and light to moderate pace and rest. That's not where the research is. The research is behind high intensity. That's the two key words there. So you can do anything from as little as 20 seconds to as much as 60 seconds. I can tell you, like, the more research that I read from different universities and different doctors that are studying this, that's the main takeaway. Like for the most part, you can't screw this up as long as you're pushing yourself, because one researcher will say, well, we have found that doing 1 minute on and 1 minute off for 20 consecutive minutes, that's where the magic happens. And then the next researcher says, well, in our studies, 30 seconds for 3 to 5 bouts, that is where the magic happens. So the reality is they're getting good results regardless when people are pushing themselves and doing this high intensity. So for the most part, you can't screw it up. So you could do as little as 20 seconds to as much as 60 seconds of high intensity work, followed by 1 to 4 minutes of rest. And that, of course, is based on how hard did you push yourself? How long did you go? If you went for 20 seconds, you probably don't need 4 minutes of rest. But if you went for 1 minute as hard as you could, like I did the other day, I felt like I needed at least 4 minutes of rest before my next bout of high intensity. So for a highly trained athlete, this might be sprinting on a track, but for someone that is very obese or has other significant health problems and can barely get out of a chair, this can be as simple as standing up and sitting down as fast as they can. So there's actually studies on this, and some really, really good studies for people in this exact specific situation, morbidly obese, prior to surgery, needing to lose weight. And this is what they did with them. Stand up, sit down as fast as they could for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 seconds, followed by rest. Or for somebody that can't even stand, it can involve punching motion while sitting, or a hand pedal bike, if you're familiar with those. You can buy those on Amazon for a tabletop. So really the takeaway here is, just like anything, where there's a will, there's a way. If you want to get it done, you can find a way to do it no matter what your situation. For women in their teens, their 20s, their 30s, you should focus more on strength and what's called hypertrophy training. That's muscle growth. So strength and growth training, more in that like 10 to 12 range when you're lifting weights or doing machines or bands. So 10 to 12 rep range to failure. That means you're pushing yourself as much as you can, and you just literally can't do that last rep with good form. So that's for teenagers, 20s, 30s, women in their late 30s, 40s, early 50s that are still in those menstruating years of life and beyond. You should focus more on strength training with what they call 2 reps in reserve. So you're not going to failure, but you're going close to failure, where you do 10 and you're like, yeah, I could maybe get 12, but I'm going to stop at 10. Not a set rule by any means, but there's some studies that show that if you're following that for those age ranges, that's going to be the best outcome for you based on female hormone and female hormone studies. So in the ideal world, as a general recommendation, I would recommend shooting for 2 to 3 days per week of that high intensity interval training, and then a minimum of 3 days per week of resistance training for your muscles, and not just doing weights or not just doing bands or just doing machines. Certainly you can do that. Anything is better than nothing, but ideally switching that up with all of those and hitting your body in different ways. Moving on to nutrition. So before I go through some of the specifics of what I recommend, keep in mind the same rules apply here that do apply in exercise. So if you found an eating protocol that seems to work well for you in relation to the phases of your cycle, by all means, you can continue to do that, because some of those recommendations where like the exercise is you should rest more, that's also based on hormones, and some of that will also apply to what you're eating nutritionally as well. So my recommendation would be, however, to follow some of the simple tips that I'm going to give you. And then what you may find is that by following those nutritional recommendations, your hormones will become more balanced, more normalized over time. And then as a result, you might not require specific nutrition during a specific phase of your cycle, because you're not going to have as many highs and lows. There's always highs and lows, but they're not going to be as severe and out of range from where they should be. And then as a result, the symptoms are not going to be as bad as well. Anytime I'm talking food, ideally you want to go organic. But the reason I'm mentioning that specifically for this podcast is that we know that pesticides are considered xenoestrogen. So this is something I recommend Googling because I think it's really incredibly important to know. And it's one of the main reasons that my family, especially with my wife and my young girls, but also for my son and I, that we choose organic with almost all of our food. So pesticides are considered xenoestrogens. And if you're not getting organic food, you have highly sprayed food with pesticides, whether it's nuts, seeds, coffee, teas, fruits and vegetables, of course, but then also the animal protein and fat that you're eating, they're eating pesticide sprayed crops. So ideally organic because, again, estrogens or xenoestrogens. So this means that it is something, a toxin that mimics estrogen activity in the body. And when you're getting a bunch of these xenoestrogens in from things like pesticides, you are dramatically throwing your hormones out of balance. You can be doing all of these great things. You're trying to nail everything else and you're doing a really good job of it. But if your body is loaded with xenoestrogens, you're still going to have hormonal imbalance because of all of the imbalance that they cause. So focus on a whole food diet that includes a wide variety of all of the following. So fruits and vegetables, I call those God's carbs. Don't fall into the trap of thinking breads and pastas and sugars and rices and oatmeals and all of these things are necessary carbs for refueling when you're exercising. Absolutely not true. Fruits and vegetables are all you need. Those are considered God's carbs. And then you have nuts and seeds. And especially with fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, hugely, hugely important for your microbiome. All of that good bacteria in your gut, the different types of fiber within those fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, those are what are feeding different classes of bacteria. When you feed those different classes of bacteria, you have a healthy microbiome that balances hormones. It's just an endless good cycle that takes place. You also want to focus on different types of fats and proteins from high quality sources like wild-caught Alaskan sockeye salmon, pasture-raised, organic fed eggs, as well as chickens and other poultry, grass-fed and finished beef, wild game, ideally shot in areas where they aren't eating GMO pesticide sprayed crops on a daily basis. Focus on building your meals around protein. Highly recommend shooting for a minimum of 0.75 grams of protein per 1 pound of ideal body weight. So if we do some simple math there, if somebody weighed 100 pounds or if their ideal body weight is 100 pounds, 75 grams of protein in a day. So building your meals around protein instead of protein just being an afterthought like it is for many people. So a minimum of 0.75 grams of protein per pound of ideal body weight, but ideally closer to 1, even up to 1.25 for women is a fantastic rule to follow. And that's going to feed your muscles and bones, especially when it's high quality, like we just talked about. And then you want to break that up throughout the day in 3 to 4 meals. That becomes more important for females than males. Males often can get away with 1 or 2 meals in a day because of differences in hormones. That's not the case with women. So you want to focus on getting that in 3 to 4 meals a day. As a woman, if you are regularly restricting your calories, if you're what's called training fasted, that means that you're exercising without eating at all, then you just have to look at it like you're robbing from your current and especially your future bone and muscle health, because that is what all of the human female research shows. Yes, you can lose weight, but you're doing that at the cost of robbing from muscle and bone because that's where a lot of the weight loss happens, not just fat loss. So whether you're trying to lose weight or not, you don't want to ideally train fasted, and you certainly don't want to restrict calories. You especially don't want to do those things on a regular basis. Here and there, obviously not a big deal, but just not doing it on a regular and consistent basis as a female. Also, as a female, instead of training fasted, which works great for males. You want to focus on getting about 15 to 20 grams of protein and then 30 grams of carbs in pre-workout, and then another 30 to 40 grams of protein post-workout within about 2 hours of your workout. So this differs also from males, where that window after workouts they're finding now is much bigger, but you want to focus on doing that in around a 2-hour period of time after your workouts. You should eat within 30 minutes of waking, ideally. This is a big one for a lot of people. And after I did the female hormone podcast, I've had countless women that have reached out to me and said, this is very hard for me. I've never done this before. But also that they are noticing huge differences in how they feel, and they're not having crashes throughout the day. So you should be eating within 30 minutes of waking, approximately, to combat the spike in cortisol that occurs in women. And then you also want to stop eating about 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. That just gives your body time to digest. So when you sleep, your body can rest, because that's what's supposed to happen. So your body rests. It's able to use its energy for healing and recovery and things like balancing hormones, instead of using that energy to digest food. As far as supplements go, all we're going to talk about today is focusing on the bare minimum of what I call that foundational 4. Probiotics, multivitamin, omega-3 fish oil, vitamin D3 with K2. And the reason for the foundational 4 is these are just basic building blocks that most people are missing. And then without these basic building blocks, your body cannot produce and balance hormones properly, or do anything else for that matter properly. So that's always why I recommend starting with that foundational 4, and not just because they're basic building blocks, but they're basic building blocks that the large majority of people in general are deficient in. So by supplementing, that is going to up your odds of not being deficient in those things, so your body can do what it's supposed to do. And then you want to make sure that those are high quality supplements from a reputable company that aren't using synthetic ingredients. Incredibly, incredibly important there. Hydration. If you're chronically dehydrated, impossible for your body to produce and balance hormones properly. So shoot for a minimum of half your ideal body weight in ounces of water per up to 1 gallon per day. Sip it gradually throughout the day. Do things like electrolytes, Element, or Baja Gold sea salt for increased hydration of your cells throughout the day. That's going to go a long ways when it comes to balancing hormones. Sleep. When it comes to a lack of sleep, and especially a lack of good deep sleep, this has a huge effect on hormones as well. Doing things like mouth taping, red or orange light bulbs on in your house instead of blue light bulbs, especially after the sun goes down, that can go a long, long way. So I recommend doing that 1 to 2 hours before bed at a minimum, and then during that same time, no screen time. When it comes to caffeine, big one for workouts especially. You want to use caffeine ideally no sooner than 90 minutes after waking, and then stop that around noon. All of these things that I just mentioned help you reach deep stages of sleep better. So that's a point that I maybe don't get across enough when I talk about sleep, because you can say like, oh, I sleep well. I fall asleep right away. I don't wake up until my alarm goes off in the morning, which is great. But when they do sleep studies and they show somebody gets exposed to blue light right before bed, and they're watching TV or they're on their phone or on a tablet right before bed, and then they do a sleep study, they might stay asleep all night long, but they don't hit the deep stages of sleep the same way that somebody would that was using orange lights, red lights, and avoiding screen time. And those same rules apply to caffeine and those other things. So that's the reason for those recommendations, is so that your body can hit the deep stages of sleep. And if you start doing those things, I promise you will notice a difference when you wake in the morning. You will wake more energetic, more clear-headed, more refreshed. Maybe not 100% of the time. I don't know if anybody does that, but certainly more often than not. When it comes to sunlight, these are just bonus things that are huge. They're free to us, and they are so often overlooked when it comes to the health of our body. Sunlight, you want to get that on your skin and in your eyes on a daily bases ideally, and not just through a window, because those block UV rays, which are important for your body. So you want to get those ideally on your skin, in your eyes on a daily basis to help balance hormones, to produce proper amounts of D3. Those things are absolutely huge when it comes to the balancing of hormones. Fresh air, simple as getting outside, doing some great breathing techniques on a regular basis. Just being outside in general, even if you're not doing these things, is good for you. But doing some great breathing techniques, you can refer to my last podcast if you want a couple of my favorite recommendations when it comes to that. Doing things like grounding, one of the most simple, effective things you can do to lower body inflammation. Kooky as it may sound to some people, I hear this from a lot of guys in my office on a regular basis who don't seem to be as open to these things, but you can lower body inflammation. That is well documented and studied, and help your body feel and heal better. And you can do that literally in as quickly as one day when you're doing that. So get your feet on the bare ground, on concrete as much as possible throughout your day. In closing, this is the main takeaway besides what I talked about earlier, but goes hand in hand with it. Is there evidence in the literature that women should be exercising differently in relation to their cycle based on muscle and strength gains? The answer is no. So the answer is no, unless, of course, you're a mouse, because that is what the science is based on. The inspirational and educational takeaways for today. Number one, as always, success equals simple habits performed daily over time. Number two, make sure you're reading and listening to legit information from people you trust, not someone who's quoting mouse studies or studies of synthetic hormones in isolation, because that is what supports the book they wrote, or that is what supports the program or product that they are trying to sell you. Number three, you are a leader. Remember, actions speak louder than words. So if you're a mother of young girls, for example, lead by example with your lifestyle habits on a daily basis, so that your daughters know that their lifestyle choices have a direct effect on how they look, feel, and heal during their menstrual cycle or during any phase of their life. The better they look, feel, and heal during their menstrual cycle phases of life early on is going to affect later stages of life. It's going to affect and improve how they handle menopause compared to somebody who isn't focusing on those things. So they do not, and this is a really important point, you have to get across the point to younger women, to young girls, that they do not have to accept the fact that they're going to feel a certain way because they have in the past, or because that's how their friends feel, or because that is what runs in the family. You can throw all of that out the window when you start adapting positive, good, healthy, foundational health lifestyle changes. So if you enjoyed today's podcast and you found it beneficial, I want you to think about all of the females in your life that need to hear this message and be a leader for them. Drop them a text, drop them an email, call them, tell them, check out the Foundational Health Podcast with Dr. Kevin Schultz on the science-based nutrition and exercise as it applies to menstrual cycles. Until next time, make health your hobby. Thank you for listening to the Foundational Health Podcast. As always, if you would like to learn more about making health your hobby, visit our website at foundationalhealth365.com and follow me on Facebook at Kevin Schultz DC Foundational Health.